Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Market Day Murder Mystery. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm so glad you're here. Isn't it remarkable how these quiet mysteries bring us together, no matter where in the world we're listening from? If you'd like, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. Now, settle in with your tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Death Among the Flower Stalls. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead's Market Square, and Miss Jane Marple paused at her garden gate to breathe in the familiar mixture of fresh bread, ripening fruit, and the earthy scent of flowers that always accompanied market day. It was a ritual she'd observed for more years than she cared to count, this weekly transformation of their quiet village square into a bustling centre of commerce and gossip. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Violet Thornbury from behind her flower stall, her weathered hands already busy arranging great bunches of chrysanthemums and late roses. "Lovely morning for the market, isn't it?" Miss Marple approached the stall with genuine pleasure. Mrs. Thornbury had been selling flowers at the weekly market for nearly 20 years, and her display was always a sight to behold. The woman had a gift for arranging her blooms in a way that made even the humblest daisy seem exotic and desirable. "Indeed it is, Mrs. Thornbury. Your roses are particularly beautiful today. I believe I shall take a bunch of those yellow ones for my sitting room." As Mrs. Thornbury wrapped the roses in brown paper, Miss Marple observed the familiar rhythm of market day beginning around them. Mr. Jameson was setting out his produce at a neighbouring stall, his movements quick and efficient as he arranged pyramids of apples and rows of fresh vegetables. Beyond him, Mrs. Fletcher was already drawing customers to her bakery stall with the irresistible aroma of fresh bread and pastries. "That'll be 3 and 6pence, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Thornbury, accepting the coins with a smile. "You're my first customer of the day. Always a good sign, that is." Miss Marple had just tucked the roses into her basket when she noticed young Tom Fletcher hurrying past with a crate of fish, his face flushed with exertion. The boy nodded respectfully but seemed unusually preoccupied for such an early hour. "Mrs. Thornbury," Miss Marple said conversationally, "I do hope you don't mind my saying, but you look rather tired this morning. Are you quite well?" The flower vendor paused in her arranging, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something in her expression. Worry, perhaps, or irritation. "Oh, it's nothing that can't be sorted, Miss Marple. Just some foolishness among the vendors. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." She forced a bright smile. "Would you look at those lovely carnations? Fresh from the market garden this morning." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught the tension in the woman's voice, and she filed the observation away in that remarkable mental catalogue of hers. In her long experience, when people insisted there was nothing to worry about, there invariably was. "I think I'll just have a word with Mrs. Fletcher about her seed cake," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I'll stop by again before I leave." She made her way through the growing crowd of shoppers, pausing here and there to exchange pleasantries with neighbours and acquaintances. The market was in full swing now, with vendors calling out their wares and customers examining produce with the critical eye of experienced bargain hunters. When she returned to Mrs. Thornbury's stall some 40 minutes later, Miss Marple was surprised to find the flower vendor sitting heavily on a wooden crate behind her display, her face pale and her breathing laboured. "My dear Mrs. Thornbury, whatever is the matter?" "Just feeling a bit poorly, Miss Marple. Nothing that a cup of tea won't cure." Mrs. Thornbury reached for a thermos flask beside her chair and poured steaming tea into a china cup. "I always bring my own tea to market day. Can't abide that weak stuff they serve at the cafe." Miss Marple watched with growing concern as Mrs. Thornbury added 2 spoonfuls of sugar from a small paper bag and stirred the tea with a slightly trembling hand. The woman took a sip, made a face, and set the cup down. "Bitter this morning," she muttered. "Perhaps I put too much sugar." She took another sip, then suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Mrs. Thornbury!" Miss Marple stepped forward in alarm as the flower vendor began to struggle for breath, her face contorting in obvious distress. The china cup fell from Mrs. Thornbury's fingers, shattering on the cobblestones as she clutched at her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear and confusion, and she seemed to be trying to speak but could only manage gasping sounds. "Help!" Miss Marple called out. "Someone fetch Doctor Haydock immediately." But even as willing hands reached out to steady the collapsing woman, Miss Marple could see it was too late. Mrs. Thornbury's face had taken on a peculiar blue tinge, and her struggles were growing weaker. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, pushing through the crowd that had gathered around the flower stall. He knelt beside Mrs. Thornbury, checking for pulse and breathing. But after a few moments he looked up and shook his head gravely. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "She's gone." Miss Marple found herself studying the faces in the crowd that pressed around them. Most showed the proper mixture of shock and sympathy one would expect at such a sudden tragedy. But there were exceptions. Mr. Jameson from the produce stall stood at the edge of the crowd, and unless Miss Marple was very much mistaken, his expression held more relief than grief. Mrs. Fletcher, the baker, had her hand pressed to her mouth in obvious distress, but young Tom Fletcher looked absolutely terrified. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly. "I couldn't help but notice a rather distinctive smell just now, rather like bitter almonds." The doctor's head snapped up, his eyes sharp and suddenly alert. He bent closer to the deceased woman, inhaling carefully. "Good God," he murmured. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack will need to be informed immediately. This was no natural death." As the crowd began to disperse under the doctor's firm directions, Miss Marple remained beside the flower stall, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a small project she had pulled from her bag. To casual observers, she appeared to be simply an elderly lady keeping herself occupied while the authorities dealt with the unfortunate situation. In reality, her keen eyes were noting every detail: the position of the broken teacup, the contents of Mrs. Thornbury's thermos, and most particularly the small paper bag of sugar that lay scattered across the cobblestones. When Inspector Slack arrived some 20 minutes later, his usual brusque manner somewhat subdued by the gravity of the situation, Miss Marple was ready with her observations. "Poison, you say, Doctor? Haydock? Well, I suppose these things happen, though it's a bad business for the village." He looked around the disrupted market square with obvious distaste. "I'll need to speak with everyone who was near the stall this morning." "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might want to pay particular attention to that sugar bag there. Mrs. Thornbury mentioned that her tea tasted unusually bitter this morning, and she had just added sugar when she was taken ill." Inspector Slack gave her one of his skeptical looks, but he dutifully made a note about the sugar. In his experience, Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations had a way of proving significant, though he would never admit as much aloud. As the inspector began his preliminary investigations, Miss Marple reflected on what she had witnessed. Mrs. Thornbury had been a respected member of the community, known for her honest dealing and quality flowers. What could have driven someone to such a desperate act? And why choose such a public venue for murder? The answer she suspected lay somewhere in that earlier comment about foolishness among the vendors. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that the most ordinary settings often conceal the most extraordinary secrets. Chapter 2: The Poisoned Produce Stand. The following morning dawned grey and cheerless, as if the very sky mourned the events of the previous day. Miss Marple sat in her morning room, gazing out at her garden while her fingers worked automatically at her knitting. The click of her needles provided a soothing rhythm as she pondered the disturbing events at the market. A sharp rap at the front door interrupted her contemplation. Mrs. Martha, Her faithful domestic help appeared in the doorway with obvious reluctance. "It's Inspector Slack, Miss Marple. Says he'd like a word, if you please." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with interest. In her experience, when Inspector Slack came calling the morning after a suspicious death, it meant the preliminary investigation had revealed something significant. "Good morning, Inspector. Do sit down. I'll have Mrs. Martha bring us some tea." Inspector Slack settled his bulk into the chintz armchair with obvious discomfort. He was not a man given to social calls, and his presence in Miss Marple's sitting room always seemed to emphasize his preference for more masculine surroundings. "Thank you, Miss Marple, but I won't be staying long. I'd come about yesterday's business. Dr. Haydock's examination has confirmed what we suspected. Mrs. Thornbury was definitely poisoned, and with cyanide, no less." Miss Marple's needles paused in their clicking. How dreadful! Such a quick-acting poison. The poor woman would have had no chance at all. None whatsoever, according to the doctor. Now, you mentioned yesterday that she had been adding sugar to her tea just before she was taken ill. We've had that sugar analyzed, and it was definitely the source of the poison. "I see. And the sugar came from where exactly?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man following a well-rehearsed script. According to several witnesses, Mrs. Thornbury had borrowed sugar from Mr. Jameson's produce stall that morning, said she'd forgotten to bring her own supply. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. How very convenient for the murderer. Using borrowed sugar meant that Mrs. Thornbury would be the only victim, as she was the only one likely to consume it. "That's what we thought too. Which brings me to why I'm here, Miss Marple. You were observing the market yesterday morning. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Jameson or his behaviour?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. "Well, now that you mention it, Inspector, there were several things that struck me as odd. Mr. Jameson seemed unusually nervous when I passed his stall, and I couldn't help but notice that his hands were stained with what appeared to be some sort of chemical substance." "Chemical stains, you say?" "Quite distinctive ones, Inspector. A sort of yellowish-brown discoloration on his fingers and under his nails. Not at all the sort of staining one would expect from handling ordinary produce." Inspector Slack made another note, his expression grim. "We had Mr. Jameson in for questioning yesterday evening. He admits to lending Mrs. Thornbury the sugar, but claims complete ignorance about any poison. Says he keeps the sugar for his own use, and had no idea anyone else would be consuming it." "And what was his explanation for the chemical stains?" "Fertilizer, he claims. Says he'd been mixing plant food for his garden early that morning." The inspector's tone suggested he found this explanation less than convincing. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's certainly possible, I suppose. Though I must say, Inspector, that Mr. Jameson struck me as being more relieved than shocked by Mrs. Thornbury's death. Not the sort of reaction one would expect from an innocent man whose kindness had inadvertently led to tragedy." The inspector leaned forward with interest. "Relieved, you say?" "Distinctly so. There was something about his posture, his expression. He was trying to appear appropriately sorrowful, but underneath I detected what I can only describe as satisfaction." Before Inspector Slack could respond, Mrs. Martha appeared in the doorway. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but there's a Mr. Pemberton at the door. Says it's urgent and concerns yesterday's unfortunate business." Miss Marple exchanged glances with the inspector. Mr. Pemberton was the market master, responsible for overseeing the weekly market and resolving disputes among the vendors. "Please show him in, Mrs. Martha." Mr. Pemberton entered the sitting room with obvious agitation. He was a thin, nervous man in his 50s, with the perpetually worried expression of someone who spent his days mediating between strong-willed individuals with competing interests. "Miss Marple, Inspector Slack. Forgive the intrusion, but I felt you should know immediately. I've been going through my appointment book, and Mrs. Thornbury had scheduled a meeting with me for yesterday afternoon. She said she had urgent matters to discuss regarding, and I quote, serious irregularities among the vendors." Inspector Slack's pen hovered over his notebook. "What sort of irregularities, Mr. Pemberton?" "She wouldn't specify over the telephone, Inspector. Said it was too serious to discuss except in person. She seemed quite distressed about whatever she'd discovered." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Mr. Pemberton with keen interest. Had Mrs. Thornbury made complaints about other vendors before? Not formal complaints, no, but she had mentioned concerns about certain practices. Nothing specific, you understand, just general uneasiness about some of the dealings she'd observed. And when was this meeting arranged? Inspector Slack inquired. 3 days ago, Inspector. She called me at home in the evening, which was unusual in itself. Mrs. Thornbury was always very proper about conducting business during regular hours. After Mr. Pemberton had departed, promising to provide the inspector with any relevant documentation, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. It seems clear that Mrs. Thornbury had discovered something that made her dangerous to someone, Miss Marple observed finally. The question is what, and to whom? We'll need to interview all the market vendors again, Inspector Slack said grimly. If there were irregularities going on, someone will know about them. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her fingers working with practiced ease. Inspector, I wonder if you might permit me to accompany you when you question Mr. Jameson again. I have a feeling there's more to his story than fertilizer stains. The inspector looked sceptical. I don't know, Miss Marple. Official police business and all that. Of course, Inspector. Though I do think it might be helpful to have someone present who knows the local personalities. These market people have been part of our community for years. Sometimes a familiar face can encourage confidences that might otherwise remain hidden. Inspector Slack considered this, then nodded reluctantly. Very well, but you're there as an observer only. No interfering with the questioning. An hour later, they found themselves at Mr. Jameson's modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. The produce vendor answered the door himself, his face showing surprise and apprehension at the sight of his unexpected visitors. Inspector, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting. That is, I thought we'd covered everything yesterday evening. Just a few follow-up questions, Mr. Jameson, Inspector Slack said smoothly. May we come in? The cottage's front room was neat but sparse, with the practical furnishings of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. Miss Marple's observant eyes took in the details. A stack of market ledgers on the side table, several empty chemical containers near the back door, and most tellingly, a pair of rubber gloves draped over the sink. Mr. Jameson, Inspector Slack began, we've had the results of the analysis on that sugar you lent to Mrs. Thornbury. It was definitely contaminated with cyanide. Jameson's face went pale. Cyanide? Good God, I had no idea. Inspector, you must believe me. I would never deliberately harm anyone, least of all poor Mrs. Thornbury. Then how do you explain the presence of poison in your sugar supply? I can't explain it. The sugar came from a perfectly ordinary bag I purchased at Miller's grocery. I've been using it myself for weeks without any ill effects. Miss Marple spoke gently. Mr. Jameson, I couldn't help but notice those chemical containers by your door. What exactly do you use them for? Jameson followed her gaze and shifted uncomfortably. Various things. Fertilizers, pesticides, cleaning solutions. Running a produce business requires all sorts of chemicals, Miss Marple. Including cyanide-based pesticides, Inspector Slack asked sharply. Well, yes, some of the more effective pest control products do contain cyanide compounds, but they're kept in clearly marked containers, and I'm extremely careful with them. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. I'm sure you are, Mr. Jameson. But tell me, had you had any recent disagreements with Mrs. Thornbury? Any business disputes or personal conflicts? For a moment Jameson hesitated, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something in his expression. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Not disagreements exactly, he said finally, but Mrs. Thornbury had been asking questions lately, about pricing, about supply sources, about various business practices among the vendors. What sort of questions? She wanted to know why some of us were able to offer such competitive prices, where we were getting our supplies, that sort of thing. I told her it was just good business sense, but she seemed to think there was something improper going on. Inspector Slack leaned forward. And was there, Mr. Jameson? Something improper, I mean. The produce vendor's hands twisted in his lap, and Miss Marple noticed that despite his claims about fertilizer stains, His fingernails were now perfectly clean. "Inspector, I want to cooperate fully with your investigation, but I need to think carefully about what I say. There are other people involved, and I don't want to make accusations I can't prove." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently as she observed Jameson's obvious internal struggle. In her long experience, when people spoke of other people being involved, it usually meant they were part of something larger and more complex than initially apparent. "Mr. Jameson," she said quietly, "I think you know more about Mrs. Thornbury's death than you're telling us, and I think you're frightened of something, or someone. Am I correct?" The man's composure finally cracked. "Yes," he whispered. "God help me, yes. But if I tell you what I know, I'm as good as dead myself." Chapter 3: Secrets at the Village Market. The confession that had trembled on Mr. Jameson's lips was destined to remain unspoken, at least for the moment. No sooner had he uttered those fateful words about being as good as dead than the sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path caused him to clamp his mouth shut with obvious terror. Inspector Slack moved quickly to the window and peered through the lace curtains. "It's young Tom Fletcher," he announced. "Looks like he's in quite a hurry." Mr. Jameson's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible. "Don't let him know I've been talking to you," he whispered urgently. "Please, Inspector, for all our sakes." Tom Fletcher's knock was loud and urgent. When Mr. Jameson opened the door, the young man's eyes immediately fell upon Inspector Slack and Miss Marple, and his expression shifted from anxiety to barely concealed panic. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Jameson. I didn't realize you had visitors. I just wanted to check on those fish deliveries we discussed." Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the artificial quality in Tom's voice. The boy was clearly improvising, and not very convincingly. "That's quite all right, Tom," Mr. Jameson replied, his voice carefully controlled. "We can discuss the deliveries later. Perhaps you should run along now." But Tom Fletcher seemed rooted to the spot, his gaze darting nervously between the inspector and Miss Marple. "Is everything all right? I mean, after what happened to Mrs. Thornbury yesterday, everyone's feeling a bit unsettled." "We're just conducting routine inquiries," Inspector Slack said firmly. "Nothing for you to concern yourself with, lad." After Tom had reluctantly departed, Mr. Jameson seemed to have recovered some of his composure, though Miss Marple noticed his hands were still trembling slightly. "Inspector, I'm afraid I may have spoken hastily earlier. The shock of learning about the cyanide, you understand. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time, when I've had a chance to collect my thoughts." Inspector Slack's expression made it clear what he thought of this sudden change of heart. But short of arresting the man, there was little he could do to compel further cooperation. As they walked back toward the village centre, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's revelations. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we're dealing with something considerably more complex than a simple case of personal animosity leading to murder." "How so, Miss Marple?" The fear in Mr. Jameson's eyes was genuine, but it wasn't the fear of someone who had committed murder. It was the fear of someone who knows he might be the next victim. They paused at the corner of the market square, where the weekly bustle had been replaced by an air of subdued tension. Several vendors were present, going through the motions of setting up their stalls, but Miss Marple could sense the undercurrent of unease that ran through the usual market day preparations. "I think," she continued, "that we need to understand more about these irregularities Mrs. Thornbury had discovered, and I suspect the key lies in examining the relationships between the various vendors more closely." Over the next several days, Miss Marple made it her business to become a more frequent visitor to the market square. She'd always been a regular customer, but now she took particular care to observe the interactions between vendors, to listen to conversations, and to note patterns that might have escaped casual notice. What she discovered was a web of relationships far more complex than she had initially imagined. On Thursday morning, while purchasing apples from a temporary vendor who had taken over Mr. Jameson's stall, she overheard Mrs. Fletcher discussing prices with another customer. "Oh, You won't find better prices anywhere in the county, Mrs. Fletcher was saying, with perhaps a touch too much emphasis. We vendors work together to make sure our customers get the best value. Miss Marple found this statement curious. In her experience, market vendors were typically competitive with one another, each trying to attract customers with better prices or superior quality. The suggestion of cooperation was unexpected and potentially significant. Later that same day, she encountered Dr. Haydock making his rounds and took the opportunity to inquire about his observations regarding the vendor's general prosperity. "It's interesting you should ask, Miss Marple," the doctor replied, adjusting his spectacles thoughtfully. "I've noticed that several of the market vendors seem to be doing uncommonly well for themselves lately. New motor cars, expensive clothing, home improvements. Rather surprising for people running what are essentially small rural businesses." "Which vendors in particular, Doctor?" "Well, the Fletchers have recently purchased a new delivery van, much larger and more expensive than their old one. Mrs. Fletcher has been seen wearing quite expensive jewellery lately, and I believe Mr. Pemberton has been making substantial improvements to his cottage." Miss Marple filed this information away with interest. Sudden prosperity among people of modest means was always worth investigating. The next opportunity for observation came on Saturday morning, when she arrived at the market earlier than usual. The square was still relatively quiet, with only a few vendors setting up their stalls. What she witnessed from her vantage point near the church gate was most illuminating. The vendors were not setting up independently, as she had always assumed. Instead, they appeared to be working according to some predetermined plan, with specific stalls being assigned to specific locations and particular vendors, coordinating with others in a manner that suggested careful organization. Most telling was a brief conversation she overheard between Mrs. Fletcher and the temporary vendor who had replaced Mr. Jameson. "Remember what we discussed about pricing," Mrs. Fletcher was saying in a low voice. "Nothing below the agreed minimum, and if anyone starts asking too many questions about supplies or sources, you refer them to Mr. Pemberton." The temporary vendor nodded nervously. "What about that Miss Marple? She's been asking a lot of questions lately." "Leave Miss Marple to me," Mrs. Fletcher replied firmly. "The important thing is that we maintain consistency in our story. Mrs. Thornbury caused enough trouble with her nosiness." Miss Marple felt a chill at these words. The casual dismissal of Mrs. Thornbury's concerns, combined with the obvious conspiracy among the vendors, painted a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than she had initially imagined. That afternoon she paid a visit to Mr. Pemberton's cottage, ostensibly to discuss the scheduling of future markets in light of recent events. What she found there confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of the market operations. Mr. Pemberton's cottage, which she remembered as modestly furnished, now boasted several expensive new additions. The sitting room contained a new wireless set, expensive furniture, and what appeared to be costly artwork on the walls. "My, Mr. Pemberton," she remarked pleasantly, "you've made some lovely improvements to your home." Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "Yes. Well, I've been fortunate in some investments lately. Nothing dramatic, you understand. Just careful planning and good timing." Miss Marple smiled and nodded, but her sharp eyes were cataloguing details. On the mantelpiece, partially concealed behind a vase, was a small leather-bound notebook. From where she sat, she could make out what appeared to be columns of figures and names. "I do hope the market will be able to continue operating smoothly despite this terrible business with Mrs. Thornbury," she said conversationally. "Oh, I'm sure it will," Pemberton replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. "The vendors are all committed to maintaining the high standards that have made our market so successful." "Successful indeed. I've noticed how well all the vendors seem to be doing lately. It's quite remarkable, really, considering the challenges facing small businesses these days." Pemberton's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing sinister, I assure you. It's just that in my experience, market vendors typically operate on rather narrow profit margins. Yet your vendors seem to be thriving. It speaks well of your management, I'm sure." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple made a mental note of the notebook on the mantelpiece and the defensive quality in Pemberton's responses. Whatever was happening at the weekly market, it was clearly more complex and profitable than simple fruit and vegetable sales. Walking home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned. The market vendors were operating according to some form of organized system, with agreed-upon pricing and territorial arrangements. They were exhibiting signs of prosperity that seemed inconsistent with their apparent business activities. And Mrs. Thornbury had been asking inconvenient questions about these arrangements shortly before her death. The pattern was becoming clear, though the specific details remained elusive. What Miss Marple was beginning to suspect was that the weekly market was being used as a front for something considerably more lucrative and possibly illegal than the sale of legitimate produce. The question now was how to prove it, and more importantly, how to do so before the person behind Mrs. Thornbury's murder decided that other inconvenient observers needed to be silenced as well. And if her growing suspicions were correct, Mrs. Thornbury would not be the last victim unless the truth could be uncovered quickly. Chapter 4. The Fishmonger's Strange Tale. Sunday afternoon found Miss Marple in her garden, tending to her late autumn roses, while pondering the increasingly complex web of relationships she had uncovered at the weekly market. The sound of the garden gate opening interrupted her contemplation, and she looked up to see old Mr. Fletcher approaching with obvious hesitation. Herbert Fletcher was a man of perhaps 65, weathered by years of early morning trips to the coast for fresh fish. He had been the market's fishmonger for as long as Miss Marple could remember, and his reputation for quality and honest dealing was unquestioned, which made his current obvious distress all the more concerning. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap respectfully, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I know it's Sunday and all, but I didn't know who else to turn to." "Not at all, Mr. Fletcher. Please do sit down. You look quite troubled." Miss Marple gestured to the garden bench, noting that the fishmonger's hands were trembling slightly as he settled himself beside her. "It's about my Tom, Miss Marple. Something's not right with the boy, and I'm at my wits' end trying to understand what's happening to him." Miss Marple set aside her gardening gloves and gave the old man her full attention. "In what way is Tom behaving strangely?" "Well, for one thing, he's been staying out late. Very late. Sometimes he don't come home until nearly dawn, and when I ask him where he's been, he gives me these vague answers about making deliveries or checking on supplies. That does seem unusual. Has his work at the market changed recently?" Mr. Fletcher shook his head emphatically. "That's just it, Miss Marple. Our fish deliveries have always been morning affairs. We go to the coast before dawn, bring back the catch, and have everything ready for market by 8 o'clock. There's never been any need for evening or late-night work." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Have you noticed any other changes in Tom's behavior?" "Oh yes, several things. He's become secretive, jumpy when people approach unexpectedly, and he's been meeting with people I don't recognize. Rough-looking men who come around after dark." The old fishmonger's voice dropped to a worried whisper. "Miss Marple, I think my boy might be involved in something illegal. I've seen the way he looks when these strangers are around. Frightened, like a rabbit caught in a trap." Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. Tom's terrified expression at Mr. Jameson's cottage suddenly made more sense in this context. "Mr. Fletcher, has Tom mentioned anything about the other market vendors? Any new arrangements or changes in how business is conducted?" The old man nodded grimly. "That's another thing that's been troubling me. Tom used to be friendly with all the vendors, especially Mrs. Thornbury, but lately he's been avoiding them, acting nervous whenever their names come up in conversation. And since Mrs. Thornbury's death, worse than ever. The boy's barely eaten, hardly sleeps. Yesterday I found him packing his things, said he was thinking of leaving St. Mary Mead entirely. When I asked why, he just said it wasn't safe here anymore." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing concern. The pattern of fear and secrecy that had begun with Mr. Jameson was clearly extending to other members of the market community. "Mr. Fletcher, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but have you noticed any changes in your family's financial circumstances lately? Any unexpected prosperity or new purchases?" The fishmonger looked puzzled by the question. "Well, now that you mention it, we've been doing better than usual. Tom insisted we needed a new delivery van, said the old one was too small for our expanding business. Cost a pretty penny, but he assured me it was necessary. And where did the money come from for this van? Tom said he'd been saving his wages and had made some successful investments. I didn't question it too closely, Miss Marple. The father likes to think his son is becoming a good businessman. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though privately she doubted that a young fishmonger's wages would stretch to purchasing expensive delivery vehicles. Mr. Fletcher, I think it might be helpful if you could arrange for me to speak with Tom privately. Perhaps this evening, if possible. The old man's face showed a mixture of hope and apprehension. Do you think you can help him, Miss Marple? Whatever trouble he's gotten himself into, I'm sure he didn't mean any harm. I believe Tom is more victim than villain in this situation, Miss Marple replied gently. But we need to understand exactly what's been happening before we can determine how to help him. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple made her way to the Fletcher cottage. She found Tom in a small shed behind the house, mechanically cleaning fishing nets with the air of someone performing familiar tasks while his mind was elsewhere entirely. Good evening, Tom. Your father said I might find you here. The young man startled violently, dropping the net he'd been working on. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression shifted from alarm to resignation. Miss Marple? I suppose you've come about Mrs. Thornbury? Partly, yes, but I'm more concerned about you at the moment. Your father is quite worried. Tom Fletcher was a pleasant-looking young man of perhaps 25, with the sturdy build and weathered complexion of someone who worked outdoors. But his eyes held a haunted quality that seemed far too old for his years. I don't know how to help him stop worrying without making things worse, he said quietly. Everything's such a mess, Miss Marple. I never wanted any of this to happen. Miss Marple settled herself on a wooden crate, her knitting appearing in her hands as if by magic. Why don't you tell me about it, Tom? Sometimes speaking about our troubles can help us see solutions we haven't considered. For several minutes Tom continued his work in silence while Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the gathering darkness. Finally he set down his tools and turned to face her. It started about 6 months ago, he began hesitantly. A man approached me at the market, said he had a business proposition. Nothing illegal, he assured me, just some special deliveries that needed to be made discreetly. What sort of deliveries? At first it seemed harmless enough. Just packages that needed to be transported to various locations around the county. He said they were valuable items that required secure handling, and that's why they paid so well. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. How well? More than I made in a month of fishing for just one night's work. The money was too good to refuse, especially with father getting older and needing help with the heavier work. But the deliveries weren't as innocent as they seemed. Tom shook his head miserably. I began to suspect something was wrong when I recognized some of the addresses. They were places I'd heard the police mention in connection with various investigations, and the packages themselves felt strange, heavy in ways that didn't match their size. Did you ask what was in them? Once. The man who hired me made it very clear that asking questions was not part of the job description. He also made it clear what would happen to people who became too curious or tried to back out of the arrangement. Miss Marple felt a chill at the implications. Tom, were other market vendors involved in these deliveries? Some of them, yes. That's how I got recruited in the first place. Mr. Jameson mentioned that there were opportunities for extra income if I was interested, and could be trusted to keep quiet about it. And Mrs. Thornbury, did she know about these activities? Tom's face crumpled with guilt and grief. She saw me loading packages into the van one night after market day. Asked what I was doing there so late. I tried to make up some story about forgotten supplies, but Mrs. Thornbury was sharp. She didn't believe me. What did she do? Started asking questions about the van, about why some of us vendors were doing so well lately, about meetings and conversations she'd overheard. She said she was going to get to the bottom of what was happening at her market. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm, and someone decided she was becoming too dangerous. I think so, yes. The night before she died, I overheard a conversation between two of the men who ran the operation. They were discussing the Mrs. Thornbury problem and how it needed to be resolved permanently. Did you recognize the voices? Tom nodded reluctantly. One of them was Mr. Pemberton. The other was someone I'd never heard before, but he seemed to be giving the orders. Miss Marple absorbed this crucial information while continuing to work on her knitting. The picture was becoming clearer, though several important pieces were still missing. Tom, these packages you've been delivering, do you have any idea what they contain? I've tried not to think about it too much, but based on their weight, size, and the secrecy involved, I suspect they're stolen goods, jewellery, silver, valuable items that need to be moved quietly and quickly. And the market serves as a perfect cover for the operation. Exactly. Who would suspect a group of ordinary vendors of running a smuggling ring? We have legitimate reasons to travel throughout the county. We know the roads and the best times to move around unnoticed, and we already have a network of relationships with people in various communities. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The scheme was actually quite clever, using the weekly market as both a front and a logistical base for illegal operations. Tom, I need to ask you something very important. Do you think your life is in danger? The young man's hands trembled as he resumed his work with the fishing nets. Yes, Miss Marple, I do. I've seen what happened to people who tried to back out or who asked too many questions. Mrs. Thornbury won't be the last person to die if this continues. Then we need to find a way to stop it, Miss Marple said firmly. But first, I need to understand more about how the operation works and who's really in charge. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on how the simple weekly market had been corrupted into something far more sinister than anyone in St. Mary Mead could have imagined. But with Tom's cooperation, she was beginning to see a path toward unraveling the conspiracy and bringing the perpetrators to justice. The question now was whether they could act quickly enough to prevent more deaths. Chapter 5, Whispers Between the Vendors. The next market day dawned crisp and clear, with a sort of autumn air that made even the most mundane activities seem invigorating. Miss Marple arrived at the market square earlier than usual, armed with her shopping basket and a carefully planned strategy for observation. She had spent the previous evening in consultation with Inspector Slack, sharing what she had learned from Tom Fletcher, while being careful to protect the young man from immediate danger. The inspector had been sceptical at first, but the accumulation of evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. We need more concrete proof, he had said firmly. Suspicions and frightened witnesses aren't enough to build a case that will stand up in court. Miss Marple had agreed, which was why she now found herself positioning herself strategically near Mrs. Fletcher's bakery stall, ostensibly examining the morning's selection of fresh bread while actually listening intently to the conversations taking place around her. The atmosphere among the vendors was noticeably different from previous market days. There was an undercurrent of tension, of whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when customers approached. Miss Marple's trained ear caught fragments of discussions that confirmed her growing understanding of the situation. Things are getting too risky, she heard one vendor mutter to another. First Mrs. Thornbury poking her nose where it didn't belong, now the police asking questions everywhere. Keep your voice down, came the sharp reply. We agreed to carry on as normal. Any changes in behaviour will only draw more attention. Miss Marple selected a loaf of bread and approached Mrs. Fletcher's stall with her usual pleasant demeanour. The baker, a plump woman in her 50s with greying hair tucked beneath a clean white cap, greeted her with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though Miss Marple detected a slight strain in her manner. Good morning, Miss Marple. Lovely day for the market, isn't it? Indeed it is, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll take one of your seed cakes, if you please. They're always so delicious. As Mrs. Fletcher wrapped the cake in brown paper, Miss Marple engaged her in seemingly casual conversation. I do hope all this dreadful business with poor Mrs. Thornbury hasn't affected the market too badly. Such a shock for everyone. Mrs. Fletcher's hands paused briefly in their wrapping. Yes, it was terrible. But life must go on, mustn't it? Mrs. Thornbury would have wanted the market to continue as normal. Quite right. Though I imagine it must be difficult to concentrate on business with the police asking so many questions. Have they spoken with all the vendors? Oh yes, they've been very thorough. Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried a note of carefully controlled irritation. Though I can't imagine what they hope to accomplish. Poor Mrs. Thornbury's death was clearly a tragic accident. Miss Marple accepted the wrapped cake with interest. An accident. But I understood the police suspected poisoning. Well, yes, but it could easily have been accidental poisoning, couldn't it? Perhaps someone confused containers, or there was contamination of some sort. These things happen. This was not the first time Miss Marple had heard this theory advanced by the vendors, and she found their collective eagerness to dismiss the possibility of deliberate murder quite telling. I suppose that's possible, she agreed mildly, though it does seem rather coincidental that Mrs. Thornbury should be accidentally poisoned just when she was planning to discuss concerns about irregularities at the market. Mrs. Fletcher's face went pale. Irregularities? What sort of irregularities? Oh, I'm not entirely certain of the details. Something Mr. Pemberton mentioned about Mrs. Thornbury having scheduled a meeting to discuss vendor practices. For a moment, Mrs. Fletcher seemed at a loss for words. Then she recovered her composure with visible effort. I'm sure it was nothing serious. You know how Mrs. Thornbury could be sometimes. Very particular about proper procedures and such. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and moved on to examine other stalls, but not before noticing Mrs. Fletcher's immediate departure from her post to engage in an urgent whispered conversation with the vendor at the adjacent stall. Her next stop was at the temporary produce stall, where she engaged the nervous replacement vendor in casual conversation about the quality of the autumn vegetables. The man, clearly uncomfortable with any attention from potential customers, kept glancing toward other stalls as if seeking guidance or reassurance. You're new to our market, aren't you? Miss Marple observed pleasantly. Yes, ma'am, just temporary-like until Mr. Jameson returns. I do hope Mr. Jameson is well. It's unusual for him to miss market day. The temporary vendor shifted uncomfortably. I believe he's taking some time to recover from the shock of what happened to Mrs. Thornbury, being so close to her stall when it happened and all. Miss Marple found this explanation curious, given that Mr. Jameson had not seemed particularly distressed by Mrs. Thornbury's death when she had observed his initial reaction. As she continued her rounds of the market stalls, Miss Marple began to notice a pattern in the vendors' behavior. They were operating with a level of coordination that seemed unusual for independent business people. Prices were remarkably consistent between stalls. There were no competitive efforts to attract customers from neighboring vendors, and there seemed to be some form of silent communication system in operation. Most tellingly, she observed several instances of vendors using what appeared to be coded language when discussing business matters. References to special orders, evening deliveries, and premium customers were made in tones that suggested meanings beyond their literal interpretation. While purchasing apples from the temporary produce vendor, Miss Marple overheard a conversation between two vendors that proved particularly illuminating. The boss says we need to be extra careful about the books for the next few weeks, one was saying in a low voice. No discrepancies, no unusual entries. What about the regular arrangements? Are they still going forward? For now, yes, but everyone needs to be more discreet. No more casual conversations where customers might overhear. Miss Marple filed this information away while maintaining her facade of an elderly lady focused on selecting the best apples for her weekly shopping. Her most significant observation came near the end of the market day, when she witnessed what appeared to be a brief but intense argument between Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Pemberton. Though she could not hear the specific words being exchanged, their body language suggested disagreement about something of considerable importance. The argument ended abruptly when Mr. Pemberton noticed Miss Marple's presence. Both individuals immediately assumed expressions of forced pleasantness, but not before Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Fletcher's obvious distress and Mr. Pemberton's controlling demeanour. As the market began to wind down for the day, Miss Marple positioned herself near the church gate, where she could observe the vendors' end-of-day activities without appearing to do so. What she witnessed confirmed many of her suspicions about the true nature of the market operations. Rather than the independent clean-up and departure she would have expected, the vendors worked with obvious coordination. Certain stalls were visited by individuals who were not customers, brief conversations were held, and what appeared to be instructions or assignments were distributed. Most significantly, she observed several vendors loading their remaining goods into vehicles, in ways that suggested the items were destined for locations other than their homes or storage facilities. Tom Fletcher, looking haggard and nervous, was among those participating in these activities, though his reluctance was obvious even from a distance. As Miss Marple made her way home, she reflected on the day's observations. The evidence was mounting that the weekly market served as the operational centre for a criminal enterprise of considerable scope and sophistication. The vendors were not independent business people, but rather members of an organised group operating under central coordination. Mrs. Thornbury's death was beginning to make perfect sense in this context. She had discovered something that threatened the entire operation, and she had been eliminated to protect the conspiracy. The question now was not whether the market vendors were involved in illegal activities, but rather how extensive those activities were, and who was ultimately responsible for directing them. Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the answers to these questions would prove both more complex and more dangerous than anyone in St. Mary Mead could have imagined. That evening, as she sat in her parlour with her knitting, Miss Marple contemplated her next moves. The vendors were clearly aware that they were under scrutiny, which meant that time was becoming a critical factor. If the organisation decided to eliminate other potential threats, more lives could be at risk. She thought particularly of Tom Fletcher, whose obvious reluctance and growing desperation made him a likely candidate for silencing. And she thought of Mrs. Fletcher, whose argument with Mr. Pemberton suggested possible dissent within the ranks of the conspiracy. In Miss Marple's long experience, criminal organisations under pressure often turned on their own members with deadly efficiency. Chapter 6, The Baker's Last Loaf. Tuesday morning brought with it a grey, drizzling rain that seemed to mirror the increasingly sombre mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple was having her customary early morning tea when the urgent sound of the telephone bell shattered the peaceful quiet of her cottage. Miss Marple? Dr. Haydock's voice carried a gravity that immediately put her on alert. I'm afraid there's been another death. Mrs. Fletcher was found this morning in her bakery. Miss Marple felt her heart sink, though she could not say she was entirely surprised by this development. What happened, Doctor? Appears to be a gas leak. The police are calling it an accident, but given recent events, I thought you should know immediately. Inspector Slack is already at the scene. Within the hour, Miss Marple had made her way through the drizzling rain to Fletcher's bakery, located on the high street just off the market square. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos, with police constables directing curious onlookers away from the building, while Inspector Slack conducted his preliminary investigation. Dr. Haydock met her at the corner, his expression grim beneath his rain-dampened hat. She was found by the milk delivery boy around 6 this morning. Door was locked from the inside, windows closed. All the signs point to accidental gas poisoning. All the signs that are meant to be seen, you mean? Miss Marple replied quietly. Precisely my thinking. Shall we have a look? Inspector Slack emerged from the bakery just as they approached, his face bearing the expression of a man who had discovered something that didn't quite fit his expectations. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, I was about to send for you both. He lowered his voice. Something peculiar about this scene. Mrs. Fletcher appears to have been baking when she died, which seems odd if she was overcome by gas fumes. They entered the bakery together, a lingering scent of gas still detectable despite the ventilation efforts of the police. Mrs. Fletcher's body had been removed, but the scene remained largely undisturbed pending further investigation. Miss Marple's observant eyes immediately took in the details that Inspector Slack had found troubling. On the main work table sat several loaves of bread, apparently fresh from the oven despite the tragic circumstances of their creation. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, may I examine those loaves more closely? I don't see why not, though I can't imagine what bread could tell us about a gas leak. Miss Marple approached the work table with the careful attention she might have given to studying a complex piece of needlework. The loaves were indeed fresh, their crusts golden brown, and their surfaces marked with a sort of decorative scoring that indicated Mrs. Fletcher's usual professional care. But as Miss Marple examined the loaves more closely, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken with excitement. Several of the loaves contained what appeared to be deliberate patterns made with raisins pressed into the dough before baking. Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack, I believe you should look at this. The two men joined her at the work table, following her pointing finger as she traced the patterns of raisins across the surface of the bread. Good heavens, Dr. Haydock breathed. Those aren't random decorations, are they? Miss Marple shook her head. I believe Mrs. Fletcher was trying to leave us a message. If you look carefully at the arrangement of the raisins, they spell out letters. Inspector Slack squinted at the bread with obvious skepticism, but as Miss Marple guided his attention across the various loaves, the pattern became unmistakable. Pemberton, he read slowly, and there, on that loaf, Knows, and the last one says ALL. Pemberton knows all, Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Fletcher was trying to tell us something about Mr. Pemberton's involvement in whatever has been happening at the market. Dr. Haydock examined the bread more closely. This would have taken considerable time and effort to create, especially under the stress of impending danger. She must have been desperately afraid of something. Inspector Slack was already making notes in his official notebook. We'll need to bring Pemberton in for questioning immediately. But first, I want to understand more about how Mrs. Fletcher died. Their examination of the bakery revealed several inconsistencies with the official explanation of accidental gas poisoning. The gas line showed signs of having been deliberately tampered with, and the timing mechanism on the main oven had been adjusted in a way that suggested someone else's involvement. Most tellingly, they discovered evidence that Mrs. Fletcher had been preparing to leave St. Mary Mead permanently. Her personal belongings were partially packed, and there were train tickets to London hidden in a drawer at her desk. She was planning to run away, Miss Marple observed. Something had frightened her enough to abandon her business and flee. Inspector Slack found additional evidence of Mrs. Fletcher's intentions in the form of a partially written letter, apparently intended for the police but never completed. Listen to this, he said, reading from the water-stained paper. I can no longer remain silent about the illegal activities that have been taking place at our weekly market. What began as a simple arrangement for mutual benefit has become something far more sinister, and I fear for my safety if I continue to participate. She was going to confess, Dr. Haydock said grimly, and someone made sure she never got the chance, Miss Marple added. Their investigation of the bakery's living quarters revealed more evidence of the criminal organization's operations. Hidden behind a loose floorboard, they discovered a small leather-bound ledger that contained detailed records of transactions, dates, and names. Inspector Slack whistled softly as he examined the ledger's contents. This is a complete record of some sort of smuggling operation. Names, dates, amounts paid, routes used. It goes back more than 2 years. Miss Marple studied the entries over his shoulder, and it shows that the operation was far more extensive than we imagined. Look at these amounts, Inspector. We're not talking about petty theft, but a major criminal enterprise. The ledger revealed that the weekly market had been used as a distribution centre for stolen goods throughout much of the county. Valuable items were brought to the market, hidden among legitimate merchandise, and then distributed to buyers through the vendors' regular delivery routes. Mrs. Fletcher's bakery had apparently served as a central coordination point, with money from the illegal sales being laundered through her legitimate business accounts. No wonder she was prosperous, Dr. Haydock observed. She was handling the financial side of the entire operation. But the ledger also revealed Mrs. Fletcher's growing discomfort with the criminal activities. Recent entries were marked with notations indicating her desire to withdraw from the operation, along with records of threats and intimidation she had received in response. The final entry, dated just 3 days before her death, was particularly chilling. Informed P that I intend to cease all participation. He made his position very clear. I fear I may have signed my own death warrant. Inspector Slack closed the ledger with grim satisfaction. This gives us everything we need to understand both murders. Mrs. Thornbury discovered the operation and was killed to silence her. Mrs. Fletcher tried to withdraw and confess, so she was eliminated as well. Miss Marple nodded, though something continued to trouble her about the sequence of events. Inspector, I believe we need to move very quickly now. If Mr. Pemberton realizes we've discovered Mrs. Fletcher's records, he may decide to eliminate other potential witnesses. You're thinking of young Tom Fletcher? Among others, anyone who knows enough about the operation to be dangerous to its continued existence. As they prepared to leave the bakery, Miss Marple took one last look at the loaves of bread that had contained Mrs. Fletcher's desperate final message. The woman had faced death with remarkable courage, using her final moments to ensure that the truth would eventually be revealed. She was a braver woman than any of us realized, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Slack was already organizing the arrest that would follow from Mrs. Fletcher's revelations. But Miss Marple suspected that the most dangerous phase of their investigation was just beginning. Mr. Pemberton now knew that his criminal organization was under serious threat. In her experience, cornered criminals often became desperately dangerous, willing to take extreme measures to protect themselves. The question was not whether he would strike again, but when and against whom. As Miss Marple made her way home through the continuing drizzle, she reflected on the courage it must have taken for Mrs. Fletcher to create her final message. The baker had known she was going to die, but she'd used her last moments to ensure that justice would eventually be served. It was a legacy that Miss Marple was determined to honor. Chapter 7. A Pattern of Market Rivalries. The arrest of Mr. Pemberton took place at dawn on Wednesday morning, executed with the sort of methodical precision that Inspector Slack reserved for cases he considered particularly significant. Miss Marple, having been invited to observe the proceedings, watched from Dr. Haydock's motor car as the market master was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defiant composure. "He's not showing much surprise," Dr. Haydock observed as they drove back toward the village centre. "No," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, which suggests he was expecting this development. The question is what arrangements he may have made in anticipation of his arrest. Her concerns proved well-founded. By midday, word had spread throughout St. Mary Mead that several other market vendors had mysteriously disappeared during the night. The temporary produce vendor, 2 of the smaller stall operators, and most significantly Tom Fletcher had all vanished without trace. "It's as if they evaporated into thin air," Inspector Slack reported grimly when he called at Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon. "Left behind personal belongings, half-eaten meals, even money in some cases. These people fled in genuine terror." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation. "Inspector, I fear we may have underestimated the scope and organization of this criminal enterprise. What we discovered in Mrs. Fletcher's ledger may represent only a fraction of the total operation." "What makes you say that?" "Consider the evidence systematically. We have a smuggling operation that has been running successfully for over 2 years, generating substantial profits for multiple participants. Such an enterprise doesn't develop overnight, nor does it operate without sophisticated planning and coordination." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The ledger showed transactions throughout the county, involving dozens of different locations and contacts. "Precisely. And Mr. Pemberton, while clearly involved, strikes me as more of a local coordinator than the ultimate authority. Someone with his limited education and provincial background could hardly have organized something of this complexity independently." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the market square where the weekly bustle had been replaced by an atmosphere of suspicious quiet. "Inspector, I believe we need to examine the pattern of how vendors came to be involved in this operation. Mrs. Fletcher's ledger may contain clues about the recruitment process and the organizational structure." They spent the next several hours analyzing the ledger's contents with the care of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. What emerged was a picture of systematic recruitment and control that confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the operation's sophistication. "Look at these dates," she said, pointing to a series of entries. "New vendors were brought into the operation at carefully spaced intervals, never more than 1 or 2 at a time. This suggests deliberate planning to avoid attracting attention." Inspector Slack studied the pattern, and they all seemed to have been approached during periods of financial difficulty. "Look here, this note about the produce vendor needing money for his wife's medical expenses, and this one about the flour vendor facing eviction. Classic recruitment technique, Miss Marple observed. Identify vulnerable individuals, offer them a solution to their problems, and gradually increase their involvement until they're too compromised to withdraw. The ledger also revealed a disturbing pattern of what could only be described as systematic intimidation and control. Vendors who attempted to reduce their participation or who asked too many questions were subjected to various forms of pressure, ranging from financial penalties to physical threats. Mrs. Thornbury's name appears here several times in recent months, Inspector Slack noted, always in connection with what are described as resistance issues and compliance problems. She was clearly marked for elimination well before her actual murder, Miss Marple said sadly. Her death was not an impulsive act, but a calculated decision by the organization's leadership. Their analysis was interrupted by Dr. Haydock's arrival, his face bearing news of obvious importance. Inspector, Miss Marple, I've just come from examining Mr. Jameson. He's agreed to make a full confession in exchange for police protection. They hurried to the police station, where they found Mr. Jameson in a state of obvious terror, but determined to cooperate with the investigation. I never wanted anyone to be hurt, he began, his hands trembling as he spoke. When they first approached me, it seemed like a harmless way to make some extra money. Just transport some packages, ask no questions, take my payment. Who approached you initially? Inspector Slack asked. A man named Morrison said he represented a group of businessmen looking for reliable people to handle discreet deliveries. Seemed legitimate enough at first. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Can you describe this Mr. Morrison? Well-dressed, educated accent, clearly had money. Said he'd been watching the market for some time, looking for people who could be trusted with important responsibilities. Jameson's account revealed the careful methodology behind the criminal organization's operations. Potential recruits were observed for months before being approached. Their financial situations and personal vulnerabilities thoroughly researched. They knew about my gambling debts, my wife's drinking problem, even my son's troubles at school, Jameson continued. Morrison made it clear that joining their operation would solve all my problems, but that refusing their offer would make those problems much worse. And the poisoning of Mrs. Thornbury? Inspector Slack pressed. Jameson's face crumpled with guilt and fear. I swear I didn't know what they were planning. Morrison told me to make sure Mrs. Thornbury used the sugar from my stall that morning, said it would make her ill enough to miss her meeting with Mr. Pemberton. I thought it was just a laxative or something to cause temporary discomfort. But you provided the poisoned sugar. Morrison gave it to me the night before, in an identical bag to my regular supply. Said to make sure I gave Mrs. Thornbury sugar from that specific bag when she asked to borrow some. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding of the organization's ruthless efficiency. Even their foot soldiers were kept ignorant of the full scope of their actions, ensuring compliance while minimizing the risk of conscience-driven betrayals. Mr. Jameson, she said gently, this Mr. Morrison, did he ever mention who he worked for? Any indication of the ultimate authority behind the operation? Only once, and I may have misunderstood. He referred to someone called the Colonel, said this person had built the organization from nothing, and didn't tolerate failure or disloyalty. Inspector Slack made careful notes. Did you ever meet this Colonel? Never. Morrison made it clear that people at my level never dealt directly with the leadership. Everything went through intermediaries like himself and Mr. Pemberton. As the interview continued, a picture emerged of a criminal organization with military-style hierarchy and discipline. The local market operation was clearly just one cell in a much larger network, with careful compartmentalization ensuring that the capture of any individual group would not compromise the entire enterprise. Inspector, Miss Marple said as they prepared to leave the police station, I believe we've solved the local murders, but we've also uncovered something much more significant. This organization represents a serious threat that extends far beyond St. Mary Mead. Agreed. I'll be contacting Scotland Yard tomorrow. This is clearly beyond the scope of local police resources. As they walked back through the village in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the complexity of what they had uncovered. What had begun as a simple case of market day murder had revealed a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating under their noses for years. The most disturbing aspect was how easily the organization had corrupted ordinary, decent people by exploiting their vulnerabilities and gradually drawing them into increasingly serious criminal activities. Mrs. Thornbury and Mrs. Fletcher had died because they had tried to resist this corruption, but their deaths had ultimately exposed the entire operation. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said as they paused at her garden gate, "I believe this case demonstrates something quite important about the nature of evil in our modern world." "How so, Miss Marple?" "Evil rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures or obvious villainy. More often, it infiltrates gradually, presenting itself as opportunity, as solutions to pressing problems, as reasonable compromises with moral principle." She looked back toward the market square, where the weekly bustle of honest commerce had been corrupted into something far more sinister. Mrs. Thornbury and Mrs. Fletcher died because they recognized that line between compromise and corruption, and they chose to stand on the right side of it, regardless of the personal cost. It was a lesson that Miss Marple suspected would prove increasingly relevant in the years to come. Chapter 8, The Hidden Ledger Book. Thursday morning brought with it a development that would prove to be the turning point in the entire investigation. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with news that immediately commanded her full attention. "We found something, Miss Marple. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about this case." Miss Marple set aside her morning correspondence and regarded the inspector with keen interest. "Indeed? What sort of something, Inspector?" "Another ledger, hidden in Mrs. Fletcher's bakery, but in a location we missed during our initial search. My constables found it this morning, concealed inside a flour barrel that appeared to contain only ordinary baking supplies." Inspector Slack produced a leather-bound volume considerably larger and more detailed than the ledger they had discovered previously. "This appears to be the master record of the entire operation, going back nearly 3 years. Miss Marple examined the ledger with the careful attention she might have given to a piece of precious needlework. The entries were meticulously organized, written in a clear, educated hand that she did not recognize. "This is not Mrs. Fletcher's handwriting," she observed immediately. "No, indeed, which raises interesting questions about who actually maintained these records and how they came to be hidden in her bakery." As they studied the ledger together, a picture emerged that was both more complex and more disturbing than anything they had previously uncovered. The scope of the criminal organization's activities extended far beyond simple smuggling, encompassing theft, fraud, extortion, and what appeared to be systematic corruption of local officials. "Look at these entries from 18 months ago," Miss Marple said, pointing to a series of transactions. "They show payments to individuals identified only by initials, but the amount suggests these were bribes to people in positions of authority." Inspector Slack studied the entries with growing concern. "Police constables, customs officials, local magistrates. It appears they systematically identified and corrupted anyone who might pose a threat to their operations." The ledger also revealed the true extent of the organization's reach throughout the county. What they had assumed was a local operation centered on St. Mary Mead was actually just one node in a network that extended across multiple counties and involved dozens of communities. Each market day operation was apparently overseen by a local coordinator like Mr. Pemberton, Miss Marple noted, but they all reported to regional supervisors, who in turn answered to this mysterious colonel figure. Most significantly, the ledger contained detailed records of what could only be described as systematic elimination of threats to the organization. Over the past 3 years, more than a dozen individuals who had attempted to withdraw from or expose the criminal network had met with accidents, sudden illnesses, or mysterious disappearances. Mrs. Thornbury and Mrs. Fletcher were not isolated cases, Inspector Slack said grimly. They were part of a pattern of calculated murder designed to maintain the organization's security. Miss Marple turned to a section of the ledger that appeared to contain operational plans and strategic objectives. "Inspector, I believe this organization was preparing for a significant expansion of their activities. Look at these entries about new territories and recruitment targets." The records showed that the criminal network had been systematically identifying and infiltrating markets, festivals, and other regular commercial gatherings throughout the region. Their goal appeared to be the creation of a comprehensive distribution system for stolen goods that would be virtually undetectable by conventional law enforcement methods. They were building something unprecedented, Miss Marple observed, a criminal organization that could operate openly, hiding in plain sight among legitimate commercial activities. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, whose expression suggested news of considerable importance. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I've just received word from London. Scotland Yard has been investigating a series of similar operations in other parts of the country. They believe we've uncovered a major piece of a much larger puzzle." The news from Scotland Yard confirmed many of Miss Marple's suspicions about the scope of the criminal organisation. Similar networks had been discovered operating in market towns throughout England, all following identical patterns of recruitment, operation, and security enforcement. The Metropolitan Police believe this is the largest organised criminal enterprise they've encountered in decades, Dr. Haydock continued. They're sending a team of specialists to coordinate with the local investigation. Miss Marple continued her examination of the ledger while absorbing this information. In her experience, criminal organizations of such scope and sophistication required exceptional leadership and planning to maintain their effectiveness. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe this ledger may contain clues about the identity of the mysterious colonel. Look at these marginal notes and corrections." The ledger contained numerous annotations in what appeared to be the same hand that had written the original entries. But scattered throughout were corrections and additions in a different handwriting, written with the sort of authoritative precision that suggested someone accustomed to command. "These corrections show military-style abbreviations and terminology," Miss Marple noted, "and the handwriting suggests someone with formal education and disciplined training." Inspector Slack studied the annotations with growing interest. "You think the colonel himself may have reviewed and corrected these records?" "It's certainly possible. Criminal leaders of this caliber rarely delegate important record-keeping entirely to subordinates. They want to maintain direct oversight of critical information." Their analysis was interrupted by a commotion outside, followed by the arrival of a police constable with urgent news. "Inspector Slack, sir. We've found Tom Fletcher. He's alive, but he's been badly injured. Says he has critical information about the organization's leadership." They hurried to the cottage where Tom Fletcher had been discovered, hidden in an abandoned farm building several miles from St. Mary Mead. The young man was conscious but clearly traumatized, his face bearing evidence of recent violence. "They tried to kill me," he whispered as Dr. Haydock examined his injuries. "When they realized the police were closing in, they decided I knew too much to be allowed to live." Miss Marple approached the injured young man with gentle concern. "Tom, you're safe now. Can you tell us who was responsible for this?" "It was Morrison, the man who recruited most of us. But he's not the real leader. There's someone else. Someone he takes orders from." Tom's account revealed crucial details about the organization's leadership structure. The mysterious colonel was not merely a figurehead, but an active participant in the organization's operations, personally involved in major decisions and strategic planning. Morrison mentioned that the colonel was coming to inspect the local operation, Tom continued with obvious effort. Said there were concerns about security breaches and that examples needed to be made. Inspector Slack leaned forward with urgent interest. "When is this inspection supposed to take place?" "Tomorrow." Morrison said the colonel wanted to personally oversee the elimination of remaining security threats. Miss Marple felt a chill at these words. The organization's leadership was apparently planning to tie up loose ends with characteristic ruthlessness, which meant that anyone with knowledge of their activities remained in mortal danger. "Tom," she said gently, "did Morrison ever describe this colonel? Any details about his appearance or background?" "Only that he was a real military officer, someone with experience in intelligence work during the war. Morrison seemed genuinely afraid of him, said the colonel didn't tolerate failure or disloyalty." As Dr. Haydock continued his examination of Tom's injuries, Miss Marple reflected on the implications of this new information. They were dealing with someone with professional training in organization, security, and elimination of threats. The ledger they had discovered was not merely a record of criminal activities, but an operational manual created by someone with sophisticated understanding of how to build and maintain a covert organization. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we have less time than we realize to bring this matter to a conclusion. If the Colonel is indeed planning to visit St. Mary Mead tomorrow, it will be to eliminate everyone who poses a threat to his organization's security." "Including us?" Miss Marple nodded grimly. "Most certainly including us. We've learned far too much to be permitted to survive." The realization that they themselves had become targets added new urgency to their investigation, but also presented an opportunity that Miss Marple was beginning to recognize. Chapter 9, Confessions at Closing Time. Friday evening descended upon St. Mary Mead with an atmosphere of barely contained tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the village. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, ostensibly occupied with her knitting, but in reality coordinating what she privately thought of as the most dangerous gambit of her investigative career. Inspector Slack had initially resisted her proposal with characteristic skepticism, but the arrival of the Scotland Yard specialist had added weight to her arguments. The plan they had devised was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. "Are you quite certain about this, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock asked for perhaps the 5th time that evening. "The risks seem extraordinary." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her old friend with calm determination. "My dear doctor, we have reached a point where conventional police methods are insufficient. This Colonel Person has demonstrated remarkable skill at avoiding detection and elimination of threats. We must draw him into a situation where his own confidence becomes his weakness." The plan was indeed audacious. Using information gleaned from Tom Fletcher's testimony and the master ledger, they had arranged for word to reach the criminal organization that a final meeting was being held at the market square after closing time. The purpose, according to the carefully planted intelligence, was to coordinate the elimination of remaining witnesses and the permanent dissolution of the local operation. Inspector Slack had positioned his men strategically around the market square, while the Scotland Yard specialist had established observation points that would allow them to identify and apprehend the organization's leadership.